On the morning of July 31st, 2005, the world woke up to the shocking news of the death of Dr. John Garang. Who killed Garang? Was it a pilot error, bad weather, or possible missile fire that brought the helicopter down? Join us as we discuss this and more on Beyond the Headlines. On July 30th, 2005, Dr. John Garang, leader of the SPLM-SPLA, was killed in a plane crash en route to New Kush in South Sudan from Entebbe, Uganda. Almost 2 weeks earlier, he had been sworn in as the first vice president of Sudan, becoming the second most powerful person in the country. The world was shocked upon learning about his death, given that he was among the primary architects of the comprehensive peace agreement that brought an end to the 21-year civil war between Southern Sudan and Sudan. We're joined today by Mr. Atem Guy Dedut, an economist and analyst. He's the editor-in-chief of the Northern Corridor Morning Post, an online-based news outlet that focuses on politics, education, technology, and covers other relevant issues. For 2 years, you did an extensive investigation about events that led to the death of Dr. John Garang, and then published your findings in a report you titled Secrets in a Flight Manifest, The Making of a Traitor. To start off, what motivated you to pursue this somewhat controversial and also sensitive issue?
Well, Eunice, thank you so much for having me. I think the death of John Garang was a very painful moment for all of us as a country. And that was particularly so because of the fact that it happened at a time when we were so hopeful. We thought things would change. We were going to become a better country, not just a better country because we had the opportunity to either become an independent nation, but also because we knew that our country was in the hands of the right man, as far as we knew how he was able to lead us in those difficult times. Now, when you sit back and start to imagine the kind of pain we went through, because when he died, I was in high school. And I remember, walking out of the classroom and I hadn't cried in years. And I found myself, tears trickling down my face, and my teacher came through and she asked me, "What's going on at Tim?" I said, "Well, we just lost our leader." You know what she said?
What did she say?
"Leaders can always be made." I said, "Well, that's not possible. Where I come from, they come in a generation. I'm not sure about yours, but it just happens that the man we lost today was not just a leader. He was a leader who was able to do with very minimal resources for 22 years. That does not always happen. And that happened in that way because he had to make sacrifices. He had to make a decision that, instead of being an excellent professor somewhere in some Western nation, doing what he has to do, not because there's anything wrong with it, he chose that his path was with his people, that he was going to be a man who fights for them, who was able to articulate what the issue was with the Republic of the Sudan, what the issue was with the government, not the people, what the solutions could be. Now, if you find somebody who is able to look at things in such a manner as not being able to take sides immediately, because we wanted South Sudan anyway, everybody did, but there was a way to do it. He was the only person who could articulate it, because if you go on the negotiating table, Eunice, and say, "This is what I want," you know what the opposition will do? They will say, "No, this is what you want, but this is what I'll give you." So if we asked for South Sudan, they would have given us something else. So John Garang was asking for Sudan, the Republic of the Sudan, which he called New Sudan. So that's what motivated me.
Now, it's important for us to delve right away into the fascinating report that you wrote. So go ahead and start off from the first account of the investigation you started.
Okay, at first, I think it was around 2018. that I got in touch with Russian helicopters. They are the ones who sell the helicopters in the secondary market. They're not the makers. The makers are Kazan. So after quite a while, I got the information from them about the seating arrangement in that helicopter, because they did everything. They needed the helicopter, seating arrangement, and then they gave it to Uganda. With the Ugandans later, they put their own brand name on it. I think AF605. So that's the initial phase. But the actual investigation as to what happened was not done with the Russians. It was actually with the Ugandans.
Yeah, I want us to go ahead and focus on why was Garang in Uganda to meet with Museveni?
The relationship between John Garang and Museveni was really that of, you cannot describe it as a friendship per se. It was more of, if you are able to mishandle my enemy, then you are my friend. So it was more of a very circumstantial relationship. You do this for me, I do this for you. So it was not organic in a way where it's a friendship that you actually start slowly and then it builds into something bigger and then you become lifelong friends. It was more of okay, you are able to handle the LRA at the border. I am able to push the LRA out of Uganda. So you are helping me, I am helping you. So I have never looked at actually President Museveni is a friend of John Garang. So on that day, the kind of conversation they had is very difficult to tell. They are the only people who know what the conversation was. You could say that it had something to do with John Garang having just become the vice president of the republic. And Museveni, maybe he wanted to brief Museveni about what had just happened and what would be the bilateral relations moving forward. Mm-hmm. So I would only work with presumptions that that's what happened.
Mm-hmm. Now, how did John Garang get to Kampala?
John Garang landed. John Garang landed in the morning, but he did not land on a Ugandan plane. He landed on, I think, a South Sudanese plane, and then he was able to be taken from there to Rwakitura. I beg your pardon. That's where the meeting was. So when they did the meeting, John Garang was able to come with a completely different plane. That's how he got to Entebbe, and then from Entebbe he was taken by UPDF.
Now, was it a one-day meeting?
It was a one-day meeting because it went on a Friday. So it was supposed to end on that day, but somehow they decided that the best thing to do was for him to have a sleepover, and then on Saturday that he was going to leave for New Push.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, who are the individuals that accompany him on the plane?
On the plane, there's misconception that other than John Garang himself, he was accompanied by 6 other South Sudanese. So that makes 7 of them. But the truth was there were only 5. So when they were doing the count, someone made a mistake of saying there were 6 South Sudanese other than John Garang himself. But the actual count was, there was Lieutenant Colonel Juma Ali Mayana Majuk. There was Lieutenant Colonel Ahmad Malwal. There was Lieutenant Denga Majung Kwany. There was First Lieutenant Oboki Obur Amaibek. There was First Lieutenant Colonel Mayandega Mabur. So the 5 of them plus John Garang, that makes 6. But during the count, and that's where it really is critical. Somebody said there were 6 South Sudanese because they count John Garang as completely separate. There were 6 South Sudanese and then John Garang. You see, that makes 7. But the truth was, no, it wasn't the case.
Where did the discrepancy come from?
It came from the initial phase of the count, because when somebody was documenting this on site, they were saying that John Garang was there. And because John Garang was there, he was such a significant person, he was not even counted. Now, they were only counting 6 South Sudanese, but it was 6 South Sudanese, including Dr. Garang.
How about the Ugandans?
So you had the pilot, who was actually Peter Nyakairu. You had captain, who was the co-pilot. His name was Paul Kiimba. And then also Patrick Igundu, who was the flight engineer. Sam Andrew Bakowa, he was a protocol officer. And then you had Lillian Kabaije, was the air hostess. Johnson B. Mananura, I just had it here, was a helicopter jet officer. And then Corporate Hassan Kiza, it was a presidential signaling officer. They had titles, but the truth was, these were professional soldiers.
Now, it's quite interesting that given the relationship you just stated between Museveni and Garang went ahead and trusted the plane being given to him. You know, why did he put so much trust in that?
You know, I think it's a mistake that was on John Garang himself, as well as people who were close to him, because when you look at the relationship between Museveni and John Garang, it was a relationship based on was almost symbiotic. I get this, you get that. But there's also power dynamics. That John Garang was now going to be almost, you know, second most powerful man in Eastern Africa. Okay. That would be, of course, if you count other presidents, you know, as a single unit. But if you look at somebody like Yoweri Museveni, who was able to hold on to power for so long, the idea was that he had power in Uganda, which of course, you know, with the nature of power, as you know it, you would be tempted to try and expand it a little bit more and say, okay, you know what, I have a little bit of influence in this region, you know, in this country and the next country and all this. But this is the other guy coming through. So what do we do? Mm-hmm. You know, that's the argument of some people I really respect, that it might have been, you know, out of sheer, you know, dislike, if you may, for lack of a better word. There could be something a lot more.
Now, in your report, you mentioned that Museveni had used the same helicopter the previous day, you know, to fly somewhere. Yeah. And then it was revamped to accommodate Garang during his flight on Saturday. What changes were you able to find out that were made on the helicopter?
Well, according to Kazan, what they do is, you know, the helicopter has got two options. It can have 26 seats, or it can have 12. But with this one, with this MI-172, what they did was that they did not do any functional modifications. The modifications were more of very cosmetic. Okay, where are the other seats going to go? How many people do we have in there? How do we make it look a lot more better? According to people who were on site at the Entebbe airport on that day, the helicopter it was not just the fuel drums that were put into the plane. It was redone in a bit. They cannot specifically say what was modified, but I can almost certainly say there were no functional modifications.
Mm-hmm. And what would you term as functional modifications?
Functional modification would be something like, okay, if you get into the plane and change the fuselage itself, look at the body of the helicopter. So you put in new ones, then you take out the wheels, you put in new wheels. Maybe you decide to change the wings as well, or go as far as to change the cyclic controls in the cockpit. Now that would be functional, okay? And if that was done on the day, then it would create a completely different argument.
Mm-hmm. Now, what time did Garang leave Entebbe for New Kush? What was the weather like?
He left around 5, I think it was 5:02. That's when he left. It was supposed to be 5 sharp, of course, and you know he was late by 2 minutes. Left at 5:02, and the weather, according to NASA on the day, was actually moderate in New Kush. It was not too hot, not too cold. What they have in the report was that it was around 23 degrees minimum and around 28 maximum.
Mm-hmm. Now, what was the distance between Entebbe to New Kush?
The distance, so there were two options. One was 502 kilometers, which was which apparently was the longest route. The other one, distance of 586 kilometers from Entebbe to Lake Yoga and Bororo. And then there was 502 kilometers from an alternative path via Soroti and flying on Obalang and Abim. That's actually in Soroti. So what they took is they took the longest one.
Why did they take the longest route?
It is difficult to tell, but if you were to fly on Lake Yoga, what then happens is you expose yourself to LRA. You have to remember as well, at that time, it was not as safe as it is now. So somebody could leak out information that there's a VIP flying here, and all you have to do, if you don't have the capacity to put in the bomb into the plane, all you have to do is position yourself somewhere with a rocket launcher and actually bring the plane down. So they do not want to take the risk. That's what they say. So the best route was northeast. And apparently it was not as safe as they had anticipated.
Mm-hmm. Now, when it comes to the helicopter itself, let's just discuss that briefly. How much weight could be accommodated on the helicopter?
I think it depends. It depends. And that would be a very excellent question for the manufacturer. But as far as I'm concerned, what they had on that day was far less than they would otherwise carry. You have a plane that is going at a cruising speed of 260 kilometers. And the altitude is not that high. That's what they decided. And then you have only 13 passengers. Okay. So what you have in the cargo hold, in the clamshell, is actually drums of fuel. And drums of fuel, you would not think that they would actually bring down a plane until they explode. So it is reasonable to think that there was no weight problem.
What was the maximum speed that the helicopter could be manned, and what was the actual speed that the pilot used?
So the maximum speed was 280 kilometers per hour. Well, they calculate that in nautical miles. You can make the conversion. And 260 kilometers per hour at a cruising speed. 260 would be what you use much later after Soroti, because when they were calling him on the ground, it was later detected that he was actually flying at anywhere between 271 to 280. So it was just a maximum speed at that time. So I think his decision was based largely on the fact that as soon as he gets closer to South Sudan, he would have to just, slow down the speed a little bit and cruise it.
Now, go ahead and describe to our viewers the incident that occurred leading up to the crash, a few minutes prior to the crash, as he was now navigating his way towards New Kush.
So the argument was that when he was approaching New Kush, the weather was terrible. And I'm quoting, by the way, the weather was terrible. He was overheard on the black box saying that there was an issue with with the cycling controls. There was an issue with the weather itself. So there was a varying degree of communications. But the actual transcript, I'm unfortunately I've not been able to put my hand on it, but it is there. So there were complaints about weather. There were complaints about the altitude, being much higher than he wanted to. There was the issue of what was the right direction to take? Should he go left? Should he go right? So there was a constant communication between him and his co-pilot. And then John Garang was able to actually chip in and ask, he chimed in and asked what the issue was. And because I haven't seen the actual transcript yet, I will not say what he said. But apparently he made some comments. And then the Ugandan was able to respond with a Afande, which is sir, everything is okay. And but apparently that was when they were coming back. It wasn't when they were going, because they actually tried to land in New Kush at least twice, but it did not happen. But that decision was not because the weather was bad. That decision was because the pilot himself was in communication with ground control, and whatever they were telling him was the cause for the ruckus. That's what was causing the inconsistency between should we land or should we not land. Okay, so so many people are. If you ask anyone at the moment, they would be so adamant that the pilot had a hand in this.
Mhm. Now,
But
earlier you mentioned that NASA stated that the weather was fine. Now
that's
you're
fine.
telling us that, okay, the pilot was complaining that the weather was bad.
Yeah.
Now, could it have just changed dramatically and caused visibility problems?
No, there's no way. There was no way that was the case. Because if you, whatever you're seeing, he is the first person who's able to tell whether the weather's good or not. It's not the ground control in Entebbe. The role of the ground control would be to tell him if he has got a problem, he reports the problem, and then they are able to respond to it. But the initiation of the conversation was coming from Entebbe. It wasn't coming from him. Okay, so his job was, no, you know, I see what I see. I see the weather's clear, so why should I turn back? So apparently there was a decision that was made at the last minute. Somebody had to create confusion to a certain degree, because as far as I'm concerned, Eunice, I do not believe, and from what I've gathered, I do not believe there was a weather issue at all. There was only the problem of the pilot not being told what to do. Mm-hmm. In order to land the plane, he was being told what to do, which was something entirely different.
Mm-hmm. Now you mentioned that they circled twice around the New Kush site, and then the pilot made the decision to go back to Uganda.
Yeah.
So talk about that decision and what happened after.
So when they were, when he decided that what he had to do was to move back, to actually fly back to Uganda, it was already past, you know, 7, I think, or maybe 7:05 p.m. And, you know, imagine a situation where, okay, you have New Kush at your back. So what you're facing, if you're facing to your left from New Kush, you are going to the Kenyan border. If you go slightly towards the east, you're going to Uganda. And that's where it was flying to. The idea was that it was not so much about what was the right direction. It was so much about what is the right path, because the peaks are very uneven. Mm-hmm. Some are higher than others. Some are, you know, slightly more flat. So he was trying to find the path there. And
so
you could
mountains. Were there mountains?
It's not mountainous as such, but there's a discrepancy. You can imagine a man who's already confused, and all he has to do now is to actually fly back. So when he was flying back, that's where the issue was, because that's where they wanted him to be. Okay, because in New Kush, though it's completely flat, there was nothing. If you want to hurt somebody there, everybody will know. But you drag them out a little bit more, put them where there are mountain ranges, you can have another argument. Mm-hmm. The argument would be that, you know, you made a mistake, mm-hmm. which is what they wanted to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So once he was starting to head back to Uganda, what happened?
Well, so there are 2 theories. One, which I will address now, is that so he was said not to have done enough clearance of the ranges. And the cumulative effect of that is that if you don't clear the ranges, you're going to slam yourself into the rocks, rather onto the mountains. And if you extend that theory, you would be saying that Peter Nyakairo did not see the mountain, one. He did not know how to detect that there was a higher range here. But that is not the case, because it's not the first time. You don't imagine Uganda to be a very flat land where you don't get to see anything. He was always flying. He knows how to detect these things. So the argument that he did not clear the ranges, the decision was made already. He was flying back to Uganda. So what would you be doing at a low altitude when you already know the decision has been made? You're not making the plane, it was already made when you decided to fly from New Kush. So it's not accurate.
Mm-hmm. And then what is the second theory?
The second theory is that the rock bodyguard theory. The rock bodyguard theory says that Juma Ali Mayen, it was a long-time bodyguard of John Garang, was inconsistent in his service. that he picked up a gun, shot John Garang, and yeah, that was it. And that it was paid much later. You know, down the road, his family was looked after, that they were given money for their service. You know, but it is not true, and that's why I said earlier that you had some of the Ugandans, including the pilot, who were professional soldiers. You had 5 other people here. You had Obura Maibek. You had another second lieutenant colonel as well. You had and 2 other guys. So it was impossible that you would shoot South Sudan's most important son, you know, in the head, and all other people would be accomplices as well. It is not a possibility. It just could not happen because it did not happen that way.
So we have the issue of the pilot error possibility, or the rogue bodyguard, as you put it. And then, can you address the Walter and Miriam story and how it plays into this?
Yeah. The Walter Buchanan really is you know, you look at it as a story that should have been completely separate from what happened. But the Buchanan families did not have a lot of money. They were not people of influence. They did not have anything. And it was by sheer luck, by trying to find out something completely different from what I was looking for, that I bumped into somebody who knew Miriam, who had lost her husband on the day that John Garang died. Her story to her is not related to South Sudanese at all. It was completely separate.
Mm-hmm.
But as I tried to find out, okay, so you run a depot at the airport. Your husband, her job was to make sure that he brings in the money and all of these things, you know, and that was the business.
Mm-hmm.
And then he loses his life on the day because, of course, you lose somebody for 15 years, you haven't seen him, you can only presume that they're dead now, can't you? You know? So when he did not show up at home, she was not able to determine where the husband was. All she knew is there were discrepancies between what he was supposed to be doing and what he actually did on a day-to-day basis at the airport.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. In the report, you mentioned Trader X. Can you describe Trader X?
Right, okay. Now, I want to go back a little bit and try to provide some kind of prelude to what happened in 2004. Now, the relationship, you and I know this, and most South Sudanese know, and I'm quite sure your audience are going to be able to identify this. There was somebody in the circle of the president, the current President Salva Kiir, who was able to provide information to him as to what was going on at John Garang's camp, as they describe it. Apparently, the argument has it that John Garang was planning to remove Salva Kiir and replace him with somebody much more competent, one of those people they call the Garang boys and all this. So the information was not accurate. But Trader X himself was able to peddle all this information. He knew who to talk to. He knew when the information would go out. He knew, when to say it. And for you to be able to do that, you need to be able to identify the weaknesses of the president. And that could be something like the inability to be able to make up your own mind, the inability to look past the information presented to you, the inability to say, okay, this is what I've heard so far, but what are the facts? What is the truth? Because you've been with somebody for 20 years and more. And all of a sudden, just as you're about to open the gates of heaven, the decision is that you think that your position is in crisis. Somebody else is going to replace you. Now, somebody with such capacity to pass information to somebody more powerful than him, with the belief that this person would believe these things, it's not a regular man, So there is a list of people, at least 7, which we were able to narrow down to 3. But The reason I particularly decided not to mention names was because pointing fingers in the dark would be construed as slander. That's why I open up the gate and say, you know what, it is up to the government now to try and find out, because they have an option. On that day, Traitor X was at Entebbe Airport. On the 30th of July, there were just a handful of planes that landed. All the government has to do is to make a decision and say, okay, now what we will do is try and talk to these airlines, get the manifest out, and see who flew in and on what date. You don't even have to have a very, big scope. You can say 12 days maximum, okay? Because to what I know, those are the critical days. And even the 12 days is far too much. You have to reduce them only to weekends, okay? So, obviously, we know who he is, and I can almost tell you certainly that I have an 85% chance that if the president and the government look deep enough, they would unearth him before daylight tomorrow, if they're interested.
Why do you think the government might be reluctant to go further into investigating the cause of the death of John Garang?
That's interesting, because there are two ways to see this. One is that they want to protect the peace and stability of the country. That's, of course, if you presume that it would ever had any stability and peace anyway. Number two, they would think that the more they do it now, they'll be digging up too much dirt. And when that happens, then they would fall into the pit themselves. You see, nobody, no matter how good they are, want to put up their hand one day and admit that they have committed a crime. We can see them in with fancy speeches and good intents, consolations in burials. But when you go past that, like what you're doing past the headlines, when you go past what you are seeing, it's highly likely that you'll see a lot more than you would believe. So they have the reasons. And I think I do know what the reasons are.
Lastly, what would you like I would encourage, first of all, our viewers to please go ahead and read this important investigative report. As I mentioned previously, it is by Mr. Atem Guy Dedut, our guest for today. And the title of this important investigative report is Secrets in a Flight Manifest the Making of a Traitor. So what would you like the readers to really take from reading this report?
I think for a start, it would just be good to know there is something like that out there. And then make a deliberate effort to try and read it when you can. If you don't have the time, then at least put up some time much later down the road and say, you know what, I am going to try and find this out. I think the more you make that commitment, the more you will actually read it, because it is up to all of us to know the facts. There are people who don't agree with what I did, who think, it's too scandalous, why do something like this? But, if we don't do it, then the problem is on us. We would be a people with no aspirations. We don't aspire for our country to be better. We don't aspire for the next generation to be better than we are. And we'll be doing a lot of disservice to our people. Mm-hmm. So just go ahead, find out about it and read it when you can, of course.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us here on Beyond the Headlines.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Okay.